Good afternoon and welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome everyone who joins us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Two favors, one for those in-house. If you'll make sure cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin, it will be appreciated. And for those listening or watching online, you're always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Dr. Matthew Spaulding, Vice President for American Studies and Director of our B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles and Politics. He is a constitutional scholar and authority on American political thought and religious liberty. He serves as a fellow at the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy and an adjunct fellow at the Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship at Hillsdale College. He was executive editor of Heritage's Guide to the Constitution, and his most recent book was We Still Hold These Truths, Rediscovering Our Principles, Reclaiming Our Future. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Spaulding. Matt?
Good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about the election of 2012, but I must begin by, of course, wishing everyone a happy International Workers' Day. Something appropriate about that, to have a conversation about the 2012 election on International Workers' Day. 2012 is supposed to be a turning point election, a decisive moment, a decisive move towards European-style social state. It was also supposed to be one of the most important elections of our lifetimes. Was it? And if so, what exactly did we decide? And if we decided something, where did we turn? In the immediate aftermath of the election, of course, there were endless assessments of the outcome, the state of American politics. Is this the apocalypse for the Republican Party or just its end? Is there a future? Where do we go? Well, we now have 6 months or so to have some hindsight, and we have some very experienced commentators to set us straight, make some informed judgments. Questions of turnout, demographic shifts, the rise of social media and its political relevance, foreign and domestic policy developments. How close was the 2012 election? Could it have gone the other way? What did we learn from it? What can it tell us about the future of electoral politics? What about the conditions and the future of American conservatism? Well, fortunately, every 4 years since 1992, my friend Jim Caesar, along with Andy Bush and Jack Pitney, both of those two at Claremont McKenna College, writes a comprehensive but very concise and pithy account of the national election, in which he talks about the nominating process, in which that particular he is actually an academic expert, the election itself, congressional elections, and he puts it in the broader context of American politics and institutions. They have done so again in After Hope and Change, the 2012 Elections and American Politics. Professor Caesar is the Harry F. Byrd Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia, where he's taught since 1976. He's written several other books on American politics, including Presidential Selection, a minor classic, I would say, in political science, Reconstructing America, and more recently, Nature and History in American Political Development. You may also know him from his popular writings on politics and culture. I strongly encourage all of those things to you. Professor Caesar will give an overview of his book, and then we'll have comments from two excellent observers of American politics. Henry Olson is director of AEI's National Research Initiative. There he studies and writes about the policy and political implications of long-term trends in social, economic, and political thought. He comes to AEI having been at the Commonwealth Foundation and the Manhattan Institute. Mike Frank is a distinguished fellow here at the Heritage Foundation, where he focuses on politics and policy and has a particular interest in polls and political trends. He comes to us with a vast political experience and knowledge, having worked on the Hill before being our Director of Congressional Relations, and then working over there again for Majority Leader Dick Armey before coming here as our Vice President of Government Relations. Both Mr. Olson and Mr. Frank write regularly and extensively, and very interestingly, I would add, about American politics and conservatism in leading newspapers, magazines, and blogs, as of course does our first speaker, James Caesar, who will now proceed to give us the definitive and final answers about the 2012 election and the future of American politics. Jim.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for the invitation to appear this morning. I know that 2012 election was a deeply disappointing moment for conservatives. At one point in our book, we remarked that for some conservatives, the election result was a Michelle Obama moment in reverse. Barack's election was the first time they had ever really felt ashamed of their country, and I think well, the disappointment was twofold. First, the widespread expectation among many conservatives, up to the last moment, and in Karl Rove's case, even beyond the last moment, that Mitt Romney would win. Indeed, Romney himself pronounced, after the election, pronounced that he was shell-shocked by the result, and I think that was the honest reaction of people in the camp that evening. Second, and more importantly, now that Mitt Romney is a bit off the scene, the realization that this election outcome likely had profound results for the character of this country. And I think Matt alluded to that. It was seen as a fork in the road, this election. Even if the campaign wasn't up to the choice, the choice was evident. Republicans had to win, they felt, to restore the country to something like the idea of a fairly limited government in America. A victory by the Democrats would lock in a path already underway, of a slide towards something like a European-style welfare state. Or, as we put it also in the book, a choice between a blue state model of high tax, high spend, high debt, say like Illinois, or a red state model like Wisconsin or Indiana. That seemed to be the choice, and I think this accurately sums up what was why it was reviewed as a fork in the road. Now, in this scenario, Republicans had to win in order to win. Democrats merely had to hang on, and they won. And hang on that they did. That's the chapter titled one book, that Hanging On. By this scenario, if nothing much is done in Washington in the next 4 years by way of added social welfare programs, the combination of the trajectory of programs in the works already and the administrative procedures that will likely, alas, be adopted in the next 4 years, given our new way of governing, means that the slide towards the blue state model is very much in evidence. So again, the theme, the Democrats won by not losing. That's all they had to do, was not lose. Now, the dual sources of disappointment for the Republicans led in the aftermath of the election, in my view, to an exaggerated and overly gloomy understanding of the election results themselves. No, the results were not that good, but one would think from much of the election commentary that followed that President Obama won a victory akin to FDR's victory in 1936, and that the Republican Party was on the verge of extinction today, a dying patient being laid out on the table for a CSI autopsy. Now, some of this commentary came, obviously, right after the election, when the president was taking the Republican Party to the cleaners on the fiscal policy, fiscal cliff negotiations, really not even to the cleaners, I should say, to surrender. And this is an ongoing problem, I think, with electoral analysis that often emanates from, say, Washington, D.C., and those right on politics. That is, the analysis of the election is infused with the emotions of the moment, or it's steeped in the politics of the day. And when you think of it, why should it be otherwise, at least in regard to politically inspired interpretations? From the viewpoint of the political practitioner, the very second, well, you should even say the nanosecond, that an election is over, the aim or objective is to interpret the election not with a view to its historical truth or accuracy, but with a view to how an interpretation will improve the future prospects of the side for which one is working. That's what our political pundits working for one side or another, that's their business. They're not historians. So the minute an election over, you start interpreting in a way that helps your side and hurts the other. The mystery, perhaps, is why Republicans were as gloomy as they were, which I attribute to the emotion of deep disappointment. In addition, Many interpreters of the election spend their time with their faces in the exit polls. The exit polls show which side has won. Indeed, they are immediately reweighted to correspond to the actual result. So the more one tries to present an objective or scientific account of the election by these polls, and that's what people seem to want, the so-called scientific account, the more the result appears to be the only one that could have been. All the contingency of the event has been squeezed out of it. It could only have turned out one way, the way that it did. And so day one or day two after the election is analysis still, well, it could have been different. By the time you're at day three, it could have only turned out the way that it did. We have the election polls, the exit polls to prove it. As long as you look at the election polls, you'll always come to that conclusion for every election. Well, it may be a disappointment to political practitioners, but the purpose of our book and all of the books in the series is to present the election results as nearly as we could in an objective way as an historical interpretation a month or two after the event. This result is not only derives from the fact that we're political scientists by occupation and vocation. I know that that's a veil which so many hide their partisanship behind. Think of that Washington composite of political scientists named Mann and Ornstein, or Mornstein as I call them. But also that this book is written by the end of December every election year. And I know from experience, which is always a harsh teacher, that what seems to be true and unassailable in December will also look a little bit different in May. And this is already the case this year as well. The Obama of Christmas is not the same Obama as the Obama of Cinco de Mayo. Now, our analysis of the real election shows first that it was a fairly modest victory by the president. Institutionally, it's the status quo. That is, Republicans control the House. They don't control the Senate or the presidency, which is where we were before the election. Every leader is the same. Nothing has changed since last September. Minority leaders, majority leaders, all the same. In absolute terms, if you look at it historically, and history is what we use frequently as the correction to try and put things in perspective, you find that since the era of modern elections, which usually many political scientists begin with 1896, so we've had 30 presidential elections, this one ranked 24th, that is towards the bottom of the list. Nowhere near the landslides. A modest victory, I think, is the way to achieve it, 24th of 30th in that list. More important, when you rank it by category, elections have to be, and there are different types, and the most important distinction is whether an incumbent is running or not. So we should rank this as an incumbent reelection category. We find this: Obama is the only one in American history, only president to be reelected who has lost votes from his initial election, between his first and second election. Because every other president who was reelected gained vote share. Obama lost it. He lost across the board. A few points, almost everywhere, but he lost it. So in a way, an argument can be made that he's the weakest reelected president in American history, at least in this sense. And that he's clearly in a weaker position as far as the election is concerned in 2012 than he was in 2008. This was not a glorious run around the track. Over the past 4 years, if you look at 2008, 2012, the Democratic Party is in worse shape. Obama came in with united government. He was reelected under divided government. He lost seats over the 4 years in the Senate and a lot of seats in the House of Representatives. Republicans are hugely better off in the states. The campaign, and you can think of campaigns in this way, campaigns that add to your personal capital or luster as you gain stature, or campaigns that in a way spend and detract from your personal stature. 2012, by comparison to 2008, present very different case. 2008 was the campaign where the stature of the individual was elevated. 2012 was, face it, a miserable campaign when compared to 2008. Hope and change was the theme of 2008. Who's going to remember the theme of 2012? Forward. It's already been forgotten. The campaign was divisive, and this is not, this I think was in the ethos of the campaign itself and admitted by the ones who devised it. It was divisive, it was small and petty. The president didn't give in any way a memorable speech. The most memorable moment of the whole campaign, I think, was his performance in the first debate, where he got whipped solidly. Incidentally, and we begin, the first chapter is called The Tale of Two Campaigns, a little bit based on The Tale of Two Cities. What worked in his favor is that he did show from this campaign that he was a tough politician, and that there's a toughness to his organization, which is probably better off for the nation. I'm sure that it's safer than the notion, unrealizable, of 2008, that he was a god or an international deity, which no human being can live up to. So it's probably better, and though he wouldn't admit it, probably better for himself, and certainly better for the nation to have a politician elected by the miserable campaign of 2012 than the really strange and all too elevating and non-political campaign of 2008. We considered next whether this election was an election that Republicans should have won, because this was a widespread view pronounced right after the election, and a disappointment. Gee, how could the Republicans have possibly lost this election, given the state of the economy, maybe given what Republicans hoped for? The economy was so bad, it was argued, that Republicans had this in their hands, and therefore the Romney team and the Republicans blew it. We conclude, again looking at historical cases and surveying the whole scene of elections, that it was an election that Republicans surely could have won, but not by any means one that they should have won. Why? Well, fact is, incumbents usually win. Go take a look at the record. And Obama was an incumbent, so he had the advantages of incumbency. And then when you look at the incumbents who actually lost in recent American history, it's going back to 1896. Taft, 1912, Hoover, 1932, Ford, 1976, Carter, 1980, Bush Sr., 1992. Those were the ones who lost. Was Obama closer to these cases than to those who won? Well, I'm not sure that that's the case when you look at it. Many of those candidates faced inter-party challenge, considerable one. Obama didn't. Many of these candidates faced third-party challenges that drew more from their support than from the opponent. Obama didn't. You look at some of these candidates that lost, and they had served, they'd come after their party had served a number of terms. Obama was just elected last time. The only one in that case, in that category, was Carter. And then when you look at the key issue of the campaign, the economy, that was clearly the Republicans' best issue. They did gain ground as a result of the performance of the economy, but it was far from being enough. When you look at the economy in 2012, it was judged to be not that bad or improving. And improving, and whose fault was the fact that the economy was bad anyhow? The last president's. These were all very powerful arguments, so that when you look at it in perspective, the idea that the Republicans should have won is all too easy an explanation, and I think a false one. They could have won it, but in no case should they have won it. Perhaps if not, unemployment had been at 9% and rising, rather than below 8% and appearing to fall, it might have been a different outcome, but such was not the case. Then you look at much could be said about the campaign of the Republicans and the candidate whom the Republicans nominated. Well, there are many complaints about the candidate. He had his weaknesses and his strengths. He was certainly the best candidate that Mitt Romney could be. You followed Mitt Romney around during the nomination process, as I did for a while. It was clear that he had many strong points, well-spoken and articulate. It's also true that he lacks a political gene. I don't think that is any news to anyone who's seen him operate. His best moments were towards the end of the campaign when he finally seemed to connect with his audiences, but that was difficult for him. But all of this, in a way, is besides the point when you look at it, since he was the only plausible candidate the Republicans had to offer by the time the race got underway. So if there were some imaginary candidate that could have won, maybe Jeb Bush or someone else, they didn't run. So this was, in a way, the best that the Republicans had to offer. And he certainly had his moments. I think his performance in the first debate was the single best performance of any candidate in the modern era in a debate. Election and election books become occasions in the genre to extrapolate about the future and try to predict the future, as if they have to. You have the results of the last election. Gee, you should know something about the next election. They should not be used in this way, by and large. How would you have predicted the election of '68 if you had written a book in 1964? Probably wouldn't extrapolate very well. In reality, one is less able to foresee the next election on the day after, that is when you begin writing such a book, day after the election, than at any time that we've had since that day. We're better positioned to predict the results in 2016, though not a very good one, than we were right after the election using the election results. In fact, it's a kind of trap to look at the election results, to think that that's going to tell you what happened next. Why? Well, the two most important factors that determine presidential elections are things that you don't know today, and you certainly don't know the day after the election. Those two things are who the candidates will be. We don't know that. And more important, how the American people will judge the record of the incumbent party, which we don't know. Those are the two decisive things that will determine the outcome of the next election. Now, of course, there are certain things that you learn from the election results, certain things, the relative strength of the party. But gee, imagine a bad performance, difficult times, and you can imagine a very different outcome in the next election than we had in this one. So with this, I now turn it over to my colleagues to talk about the real future and not the future that we learned from the election.
Thank you, Jim. I always try and follow some of the great precepts of the New Testament, like do unto others as you'd have done unto you. But this is the first and probably only time in my life that I can follow one that I never thought I'd have a chance, which is to render unto Caesar what is Caesar. So what does, what due should I give to Caesar? Well, I come to praise Caesar, not to bury him. After Hope and Change is a fine book. It gets virtually everything right. It does it tersely, it does it succinctly, it does it interestingly, it's well argued, it's well reasoned. If it misses the breathless, personal, I was there at the moment details of many contemporary post-election write-ups, that's all for the good. Oftentimes that merely serves to inflate the self-importance of the person that's being quoted or the person who's taking the quote, and in fact is a way to look closely and minutely at all of the trees and completely miss the forest. In this book, Jim and his co-authors may miss a couple of juicy trees by not having those quotes, but you'll never miss the forest. I think his basic assessment, as he said, that this is an election that the Republicans could have won but not should have won, is absolutely correct. So then the question for those of us who are in the conservative movement, and while I write, as I said in my pre-election prediction, which was depressingly correct, while I write as an analyst, I have a heart that beats as a partisan, so I hope that we can come back from this. I'd like to make 2 points slightly differing where I do disagree with Jim as a way of pointing us towards a discussion that can help us think about this. First, gloom. I have been gloomy since 2008. I'm not gloomy because I want conservatives to lose, quite the contrary. I'm not gloomy because I think we can't win, which is what Rudy Teixeira and the Democratic Washington establishment would like to beat into our heads. I'm gloomy because I think there are headwinds that we face now that we did not face in the 80s and the 90s, that failure to recognize, which means that we'll sail our conservative ship into the winds rather than tack to go along with the winds and steer it in our direction. I think that this was a historic election. I think it points towards a general tendency that will make it more difficult for conservative ideas as they have been currently interpreted and argued, and I will get to that point later, to win. Let's take the election since 1896, as Jim has. Since that time, Republicans candidates have won a majority of the vote. Oftentimes, as we know, presidents win with the minority of the popular vote. Republicans have won with the majority of the vote 14 times. Democrats, only 8. Take out the era pre-New Deal. Republicans have still won a majority of the vote 7 times, Democrats only 4. 2 of them are the last 2 elections. Woodrow Wilson never won 50% of the vote. Harry Truman never won 50% of the vote. John F. Kennedy never won 50% of the vote. William Jefferson Clinton never won 50% of the vote. In fact, the only Democrats who have ever been reelected with 50% of the vote in the history of the Democratic Party since most states began electing delegates by popular vote in the 1824 to 1828 period. There are only 3. Andrew Jackson, whose victory set forth a period of Democratic dominance of the American political sphere for most of the following 36 years, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who did likewise, and Barack Hussein Obama. The Democratic Party rarely wins 50% of the vote precisely because of the natural conservative tendencies, and conservative in the sense of cautious tendencies of the American people. The fact that we've experienced the only 3rd time in a 200-plus year of American history where that has happened, and we've seen it with somebody who has been more explicitly center-left or leftist than any previous candidate who has succeeded to the presidency, should give us reason to pause. Another historical tidbit. While individual elections come and go and individual elections are decided along many of the lines that Jim talked about, there are certain trends at the presidential level. That since 1789, the presidency, and if you count by 36-year cycles, has always been dominated by one party or another. Since 1828, the party that dominates those 36-year cycles always wins at the beginning, either 4 in a row, 5 in a row, 6 in a row, or 4 or 5 out of 6. The Republican era that we just went through saw Nixon win twice, Carter win in a squeaker, and Republicans win 3 in a row, 5 out of 6. By 1988, people were talking about the Republican lock on the Electoral College. The 36-year cycle ended at the beginning of the Obama administration. So we have another historical feature here, that the way American politics has tended to go has not meant that the party in the minority during the cycle can't win, but that it either is harder to win or they have to tack in a way, often becoming a Me Too version of the dominant party, the way the Whigs became Me Too Democrats by electing expansionist generals, or the way Eisenhower was a Me Too Democrat by accepting most of the New Deal, or the way Clinton was a Me Too Reaganite by accepting, from the left's view, the most important aspects of Reaganism. Does that mean that we are dinosaurs as conservatives? Not in the slightest. I think what it means is that we have to be very honest about where we stand and why people aren't electing us at a national level, and what we need to do to get them on our side again. I want to point you to one question in the exit poll, which I think explains this. And I know this is an oversimplification, and I hope in Q&A we can get into more of it, but there's one question that I think is key to understanding the current conservative dilemma. At the end of the exit poll, voters were asked, which of 4 qualities do you most want to see in a president? 79% of Americans selected 3 of those 4. Shares my values, has a vision for America, is a strong leader. Mitt Romney won each of those groups by between 9 and 23 points. Okay. Usually when you carry 79% of the electorate by an average of 14 percentage points, you're going to win the race. He lost by 4 points in the end. It was not a close race, not a landslide, but it wasn't close. Because the other 21% of the voters, the group that picked the fourth characteristic, supported Obama by 63 points. And that characteristic was cares about people like me. If you take a look at the entire Obama campaign, everything they did was meant to drive home to a particular group of the electorate that the Republicans and Mitt Romney do not care about you. If you're Hispanic, you want the American dream, they won't even consider the DREAM Act. They don't care about you. If you're a woman, forget abortion, they don't even like contraception, they'd rather back priests than you, they don't care about you. You're a low-skilled worker, the Republicans' economic policy is basically give more money to their friends who are rich and hope they do right by you. They don't care about you. Now, each of us who are conservatives can say, but that's caricature. But that doesn't state the true reasons why we're running. But then it's incumbent upon us to state our case clearly and plainly. The only way to beat a caricature is with the truth well stated and persuasively argued. I would submit that we're talking in Washington about racial gaps, about marriage gaps, about gender gaps, about age gaps, and they're all symptoms of the underlying disease. We suffer from an empathy gap. Now, it's not a gap that we can't close, and Ronald Reagan shows us the way. When Ronald Reagan was running, he, from the moment of his political career, 1964, made clear that his focus was on the dignity of the average person. He wanted to liberate people to do great things, but he also wanted to make it clear that the average person's aspirations were worthy of respect and should be the focal point of policy. When he was analyzing the defeat of Barry Goldwater in 1964, he said conservatives should focus on the simple soul, the person who bucks for a raise, goes to work, pays his mortgage, tithes or gives to his church, and knows there's no such thing as a free lunch. Now, when the conservative movement can talk more about a person whose aspirations are not to build a business or to conquer the universe, but rather to get through the day and be a decent dad or mom. When we can say that again with our full voice and with our full throats, then I think we will begin to close the empathy gap. We'll be able to tell a low-income Hispanic worker who's working 50 hours a week that they have dignity. We'll be able to talk to the trucker who makes $50,000 a year by driving long rigs between Kansas City and Colorado, that we value the work that they do, even if they're never going to build anything more than an addition onto the back bungalow of their house. I think that the Republican future can be bright. Americans do not want the Center for American Progress's agenda. But if the only thing they are faced with is the cap agenda and a conservative agenda that implicitly, as was too often the case in the 2012 campaign, says that the average person is worthy of dignity only when they can reach for the stars, well then regretfully they will choose that which they do not want, and we will move towards Europe willingly or not.
Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to Heritage. It's great to be here. In reading Professor Caesar's book, a couple of things struck me, and I wanted to focus on questions that I've had about the election and the electorate now for some time, which is I was struck by part of his discussion toward the end about one of the findings in the exit polls that 59% of voters on Election Day identified the economy as the single most important issue. And I'll talk about that in a second, that the kind of economy that the voters were living in on Election Day. But what happened among that group of voters? Romney won them, but only by 4 percentage points. And that struck me as being a very telling finding, because if you just spend 20 minutes Googling, and you can start finding examples of the kind of economic malaise, can I use that word, that confronted the voters on Election Day. I'll give you a few examples of that. Incomes have been flat for 12 years. You have to go back to 1999 to find the highest median income level that we've had. So for 12 years we've been flat. Household wealth, savings, equities, and homes and other investments has plummeted. The one that, as a parent of 4 kids, strikes the most fear in my heart is that long after their parents and grandparents were out, trying to make things out on their own, 1/3 of 20-somethings still live at home with mom and dad. And if that's not enough to strike fear in the hearts of 40 and 50 and 60-somethings out there, nothing else is. And that's been going up quite a bit in recent years, that percentage. So there's and that's, behind that, there's a lot of tragedies. There's a lot of dreams that are not being lived out. There's a lot of adults living in mom and dad's basement who really don't want to be there. According to the Pew Research Center, more than 1 in 5 Americans between 18 and 34 years of age told them that they postponed having a baby because of the bad economy, were holding off marriage until it recovered, and more than 1/3 of the 25 to 29-year-olds, again, had been forced to move back in with their mom and dad. Okay, so this is a pretty big chunk of the electorate. The younger people especially are, there's something called now NEETs, the NEET generation, not in employment, education, or training, and the percentage of Americans in that category, and this is sort of a global phenomenon in developed countries, is higher in 2012, over 6.1 million, than it was 5 years earlier, which is a trend in some of these numbers, which is that since the recession hit and since the so-called recovery began, some of these trend lines have actually gotten worse. Median income is actually lower now than it was at the beginning of the recovery. Okay, think about that for a second. This is the economy people were voting in. The poverty rate is higher than it was since the recovery began. The period of time out of work, median number of weeks unemployed, climbed from 8.5 in 2007 to 15.1 in 2009, and now it's at 21.4, or it was at 21.4, the most recent set of numbers. So even with this so-called recovery, things were getting worse, more claustrophobic for a lot of people who were voting on Election Day. And here's a sort of frightening number, too, is that since the bottoming out of the job numbers, you often hear the president boast, and he did this during the campaign, that the private economy had created X million new jobs, and it was basically through the campaign day, it was 6.4 million jobs, private sector jobs created. They took great credit for. But during that exact same period of time, 8 million people were added to the food stamp rolls. Okay, 1.4 people were added to the food stamp rolls for every private sector job created during that period of time. That was about a year and a half or so period, February of 2010 to November 2012. The percentage of Americans say they're in the lower middle class has gone from 1/4 to 1/3 during this time. This is Pew. There's a lot of those other numbers that indicate self-perception of where people are economically has diminished profoundly, and it's sort of settled in to a higher norm than had been the case before. National Journal has a new poll out that I would encourage people to look at. It's the Heartland poll, came out last Friday. Ron Brownstein has some good summary articles to flesh it out. But the key finding that in his entire survey is that most families now believe that the most valuable and elusive possession in American life is no longer a tangible acquisition such as a house or a car or something material, but really just economic security. People have come down quite a bit in their expectations in life. And you can find there's a lot of data that support that. 20% by a margin of 60% to 20% say today's middle class has less rather than more expendable income. It's less job security, and it's harder to basically move up in life compared to their parents. There's a lot of that. Now, is this all negative? Well, normally, I think historically, you have an electorate encountering that kind of conundrum on the president's and incumbent's watch. You would expect a different sort of an outcome. And one of the interesting findings in the Heartland poll is that a lot of people still, when asked what's the proper role for government in the economy, will say government's the problem. A plurality of 39% say government is the problem, and 29% more say that they think government might have a role, but they just don't trust government, which gets at another point, which is that we're kind of at historic lows, roughly, in the level of trust people have toward the government. The Heartland poll found that the level of trust in Congress, okay, to do the wrong thing was 64%, the right thing 8%. That's single digits, 8%. And the president was better, but not by a whole lot. He was underwater by about 10 points. Are we heading, I guess the big question, and Henry raises a lot of this, is are we heading toward a time when, like de Tocqueville said, the American people will become a herd of timid and industrious animals? I hope not. I don't think so. But I'm going to leave you with one marker that struck fear in my heart and bedevils me at a lot of different levels, and it's an article that appeared in the Washington Post earlier in the week. In Florida, a food stamp recruiter deals with wrenching choices, which I don't know if anyone's read, but it basically shows how the progressive policy agenda can be used in ways to corrupt the system and pull more people into its grip, which is Dilly Nerios is a woman that they profile, hired by a nonprofit in the state of Florida that receives Florida state grants to do what? To meet a quota of 150 new enrollees per month in the food stamps program among communities of 55 and over communities in Florida. And it profiles the way in which she reaches out to these individuals and the way in which one person said, look, I've always been a maker, not a taker. He actually used that language. And I don't want to become a taker. And she convinced him, said, you deserve this. You've earned this. And little by little, she's working on him. The final part of it, she leaves him. He has still resisted, but she left him her card, and he accepted her card, suggesting maybe he's going to succumb at some point. And part of the insidious nature of this is that here you have a state run by Republicans, essentially, at the state level. And one of the arguments that they are making for these kinds of programs is that food stamps is 100% federal money, and they calculate that they can bring in about $6 billion a year in federal money to stimulate their economy. They've bought into this notion, but it's other people's money they're spending. They're bringing in other people's tax dollars to their state. And multiply that one example out. And this is what I think is the biggest challenge a lot of us as conservatives face, is that to what extent can the different institutions that are created by this government be used to further their agenda and expand their reach? The final thing I'll mention is if you've seen, as Obamacare is starting to kick in, there's a form that's on the internet. I think it's anywhere from, depending on how you print it out, 20 to 60 pages long to apply for subsidies in the exchanges. You know the last question on that form is? Are you registered to vote? Yes. Okay? And there's going to be an army of what they call navigators out there, running around the country trying to recruit people to help them get their subsidies that they deserve, that they earned, right? And a lot of them are going to be used as a surrogate way to get them to vote. And it's that kind of on-the-ground game that surmounts and goes beyond the election cycle that is, I think, a real threat. We've got to get around that as conservatives. Henry has a good set of ideas here, and Heritage has a lot of proposals that are designed to reverse that, which I call Saving the American Dream. I would encourage you to look at it. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Jim, I will give you the opportunity to respond to these scurrilous attacks.
Well, just very quickly on Henry's point, this point about cares about people like me is one we spent some time on, and the striking idea that on personal qualities, Romney scored very well, except on that one. I think that's true. This was this was something that Obama's people realized from the beginning, that they were going to attack Romney as a rich person. They took this from the primary campaign because Republicans did the same thing. And it is true, when you think about it, the great disadvantage of Mitt Romney, whatever it is he happened to be a very rich person, the richest ever to run for president, defending capitalism. That's an awfully hard thing to do. You could imagine, I agree with Henry's point that you don't want to just sell the idea that the Republican Party is for those who build things, that there's dignity just in building smaller things. But if you would want to carry that message, it's very difficult to carry that message if you're a wealthy white person who also happens to utter nonsensical things, like the number of Cadillacs in his garage, his favorite sport, dressage, and not to mention the 47% remark. Not even being a minority of a Mormon helped, because in American political thinking, this is not considered a subaltern group. He also had the disadvantage of going to Harvard. All these things put him right at the top of difficulty in this. And the way he made his money, I think this is important. He made his money through finance. There wasn't anything that he could say, I built this, and here it is. You could imagine a rich person selling something like that. Here's the product that I built. American people don't understand finance. Henry, went all the way back to Jackson. That was what Jackson understood as well in his campaign. People don't understand finance, and they mistrust finance, and with in many ways with good reason. What is it that gave us our financial crisis in a way in 2008? Had a lot to do with these guys in finance who think they know it all, and who've driven the country to ruin. Was never able to close that. Now, even with the same message, I agree with Henry's critique, a different candidate could have presented that message in another way. When you heard a poorer person, a Marco Rubio, showing that this was the way up in American, the opportunity was the way up, it would have had a different resonance. So we suffered from that very important fact in the campaign, no doubt about it. I don't think it's intrinsic to the Republican message, but I certainly agree with Henry's point that beyond producing the idea that we built it, this idea of the dignity of the average person would be important as well. Now, on your point, Frank, very, very interesting. One of the problems in the poor performance of the economy, as you pointed out, is that these problems and difficulties are listed over the past 12 years, not over just the past 4 years. So this was Obama's argument. I didn't begin this. This is what I was given, and plausibly tried to deflect the criticism to the Republicans. I think one of the lasting problems of the 2012 campaign, and this does go a little bit to Romney, I'm not sure if he could have changed it, was in a way not combating the fact that the cause of the crisis in 2008 wasn't just the Republican message, but what Democrats had done. He in a way just said the economy's bad, it happened on your watch. But he would have had to go back and revisit what got us into that financial crisis in a much more substantial way, and didn't. And that's kind of left on the table. How important, I don't know. But really, these difficulties in the economy are perceived to be endemic. And then the last couple points which you brought up, which are really central to our analysis, what about this advantage that the Democrats have, namely that they're giving away lots of candy, as Romney said. There's truth to this. You could say the Democrats' view of the common good, let's take them at their word, of social justice, also has the advantage of creating clientele. The Republican view of the good, that is individual opportunity, does less well in building up electoral clientele. That's a permanent disadvantage of the Republican free enterprise idea. There's just less people who take it. Now, you can say an entitlement doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to continue to vote for that party. The majority of older people voted for Romney despite the fact that they receive Social Security. An entitlement means that you get it regardless. But the problem is this in the Republicans' argument in 2012. For some of these new entitlements, the Republicans said, we're going to take these away or cut them back. Now, this is where Obama was able to succeed so well, and we hypothesized that this was not just in those who voted, but those who didn't turn out to vote, is something like this. People thought that a benefit that they had or recently acquired was going to be taken away from them, and it would be in some sense. That was the Republican message. We darn well better cut back, or this is the end of the country. Add to this this point, and this would be my final point on this. When you think about it, and I've experienced this spending a lot of time in Europe, a lot of people might have thought in 2012, might have thought that the economy would have done better under Romney, perhaps. But they asked the question, would I have done better where I am now? And now I'm talking to people in the groups that you're no, I might lose my food stamps, and I need that, or at least I want it. I might lose my cell phone. No, I need it and I want it. When they started calculating their individual fate, they weren't sure that they would be better off, even if the economy would be slightly better off. So I think this is the core of the a Democratic and Obama, let's say, political strategy. Leave aside their general view of justice. I think they believe in this generally for lots of different reasons. But the core of the political thing was just that. We can give you something that, especially in bad times, makes sure that your life is better off. So in a way, the worse the times, the better it is for the Democrats in that one respect, as long as the hope remains that things can change. I think that was critical, and I think that the electoral analysis that's going to finally bear this out, though we only sketched this in this very briefly, is not necessarily those who voted, but those who didn't vote. I think those were the ones that normally could have voted for a Republican. I'm talking about, let's say, whites in distress, and who either saw the advantages that they had personally from these new programs or were fearful of what would happen in their own lives if Republicans won.
Great. With that, we have some time for some questions. I think there's some microphones somewhere. So right in the middle, we'll start there.
Diane Silber, clinical psychologist. This is for Henry Olson. When you talked about changing the message, are you talking about the message or policy? And whatever changes you're recommending, what would those be?
I think we need to be honest with ourselves, which is that the conservative agenda today is what would have been considered 60 years ago to be a large government agenda. That the Paul Ryan heritage plans differ in some very important details, but both of them would leave the federal government between 18 and 19% of GDP. Texas is one of the smallest state governments around. It takes about 10% of GDP. So if we enacted the heritage budget and every state ran itself as well as Texas, it would take only slightly less in GDP at the end of that, which of course would take a huge political struggle in order to get to. We would still have Social Security. We would still have Medicare. We would still have Medicaid. We would still have K through 12 education. We would still have extensive federal and state aid for higher education. So when we talk about government in a way that actually ignores what our platform is, that raises people's fears beyond a reasonable point about what the focal point of Republican and conservative governance is, we create the empathy gap. I think when we succeed is when we talk about governing in a way that embraces our values, and welfare reform is the great example of that. That welfare reform was a Republican conservative argument that rather than eliminate the federal aid, rather than kick everybody out onto the street, we were going to reform it so that it encouraged good behavior. And what we saw was that we won the compassion argument. We said we will give aid to people who need it, and for people who don't, we won't give it. And for people who are in between, we'll give them the aid that they need, which is counseling to get to work, which is childcare so they can stay and work. We saw the welfare rolls drop by 70%. We saw single women going into the private sector rise to massive highs, which continue to be historically high, even through the Great Recession. I think a conservative agenda that is true to itself is one that the American people want to hear. But they did not hear that in 2012. They do not hear that as often as they should in Washington. They hear Republicans talking and conservatives talking about their true agenda as in tones that would give people reasonable fear to think that they're not committed to the very things that they're talking about. So if we actually talked in the sort of language that Ronald Reagan talked in, that we talked in with welfare reform, I think we would find that Americans want that government, and I think it would lead to better government, smaller government, and it would certainly forestall the rises in government that the Center for American Progress and the Obama administration proposed.
I'll add something. I don't disagree with that, but at all. But I think there's another issue to this: is the dawning realization that whatever you say you want, you have to be able to afford it, and therefore the debt issue. And what people have to see is that countries that promise more than they can deliver will end up in bankruptcy. Greece almost did this, and I believe you don't even have to make the compassion argument to say, look, you want about what you have now, or something at least. The country has to prosper. under the alternative circumstances, the country as a whole will fail. So maybe even without making too much of the case that Henry mentions, a good few more bankrupt states would do it. A failure of a major American state would show that this model simply can't sustain itself. So in addition to the personal argument, there's also this macro argument. The problem is people keep saying that the debt is unsustainable, but that's not a reality. What does unsustainable mean, and when does unsustainable become unsustainable? That hasn't yet been brought home. People have to see the result. Greece almost did it. Maybe in the next 4 years we'll see governments fail.
But I'd also like to just, right now, between the federal and state government, we take about 35% of GDP at all levels, somewhere between 35 and 36%. That's roughly what Australia takes. It's on the low end of the developed nation scale. Sweden is at about 50%, continental Europe's in the high 40s, 35%. The reason Australia has a minor budget deficit right now is because they have a VAT. They have a 10% goods and services tax, and they have taxes. The top rate doesn't kick in at $450,000 a year. It kicks in much lower than that. So debt can only get us so far. The VAT in Australia was implemented by the conservative Howard government to balance the books. Debt without and this is where I both agree but also disagree, but debt without a positive vision leaves us powerless to argue against the sort of wide consumption tax that the left is itching to put in, and which in both Canada and Australia were put in by the right precisely to solve looming budget deficits. If we combine a concern about money with an argument about life, which is what government does well, or could do better under our governance, I think we'll have much more moral legitimacy to forestall the massive tax increases that would make us, if not Europe, at least much more like the United Kingdom or Canada in terms of government involvement in the economy.
Let's see here in the middle, right in the front section up here. Right here.
Thank you so much. Elliot Geiser, intern here at the Heritage Foundation. I'm curious about the discussion that each of you seem to touch on, which is the idea of appealing to the average American. And my thought is, and I would love your take on that, what is the average American now, and what is their ideology? It seems like, the constant portrayal, and what it felt like to me as a young person involved in the election, was that people my own age looked at Barack Obama as both mainstream and hipster at the same time, and Romney as kind of both backwoods and elitist at the same time, which seemed to be this sort of strange contradiction. And as conservatives, should we attempt to conform ourselves more towards the mainstream of American culture and thought, or should we try and influence that American culture and thought to be more like what we are supposedly seem to want? Or is it sort of both and?
A successful political leader always does both. As for what the average voter is and wants, I can give you a quick snapshot. The average voter is a college dropout. Or as they say in polite polling terms, some college. It means a college. It means a college dropout, like my parents. The average voter is roughly a lapsed Catholic, somebody who attends services once in a while, is neither Protestant nor a non-believer. The person is married with children, making $40,000 to $50,000 a year. They live in the Midwest. They probably are both employed. They are people who are not in the three-part, what do you think of government? From the Heartland poll is very interesting because they take the quote from Ronald Reagan from the first inaugural. In the current economic circumstances, government is the problem, not the solution. Who agreed with that? About 39% agreed with that, which is nearly identical to what most polls say is conservative. The middle group, the average voter, took the position that they thought government had a role, but they didn't trust them. What the Republican and conservatives have to do is talk to that person. Talk to that person who doesn't have a lot of investments. Talk to that person who's never going to be wealthy. Talk to the person who dropped out of college, who doesn't want to build anything more than a decent, comfortable life for themselves and hope that their kids can do better. The simple soul that Ronald Reagan spoke with. And that is not somebody who is presented with, if that person is presented with the only choices before them being cloaked libertarianism and cloaked progressivism, which is kind of what they felt they had this time. They won't like either choice, but on balance, they'll choose cloaked progressivism because better the devil that they know than the devil that they don't.
One thing I would just add, beware of, and Henry's making this point too, beware of overgeneralizing in terms of different demographic groups. In one part of the book, professor and his colleagues make reference to people with postgraduate degrees and how Obama did quite well among that group. And I took a look at that, just if you look at the different exit polls that were done by state. And in fact, one of the great tragedies, I think, is that every state now doesn't have exit polls done. I wish they'd continue that tradition. But, for example,
Government ought to pass a law.
yeah, well, or maybe academics could do less studying of the sex habits of, why teenagers drink beer in dorms and more on something useful like this. But anyway, for example, among postgraduates, you had the obvious, which is in states like Vermont, Massachusetts, and California, even New Jersey, about 2/3 or more of people with postgraduate degrees voted for Obama. But then you have other states, a lot of states, Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, even Illinois, were all pretty much competitive. Ohio was 50% Obama, 48% Romney among people with postgraduate degrees. And some of the southern states and in Missouri, you had over 50% of people with postgraduate degrees voting for Romney. And some states that I would suspect would be even higher, like Texas and Oklahoma, they didn't do exit polls for some reason in those states. So even within some of these groups that we tend to talk of very easily as a group, they're very, very different from one part of the country to another. There's a big sorting that's gone on in this country. A lot of studies are showing how you can almost do a clean Democrat or Republican congressional district without having the district look like some kind of a piece of modern art. Where the lines can be much more contiguous and compact. And because of the way people have sorted themselves along, for whatever reason, along ideological lines, then you find counties or communities are much more ideologically coherent than would have been the case 20, 30, 40 years ago.
That's what we're here. And depending on the question and the answers, this might use up our time. I don't
Yes,
want to
sir.
take too much.
My name is
but
Cami
please
Butt,
try to
and
get
my question is, would you shed some light about Democrat propaganda or fear among immigrant? I use word propaganda and fear because it's Obama who has deported more people than any other president. But still, he was able to kind of make this very common about immigrant. I'm not talking about illegal immigrant. I'm talking about legal, who are even citizens, that somehow, if Republican win, they would go after immigrant or kick them out or do something if they're brown or something like. I don't want to repeat the example that I gave you after a couple of days of the election at the American Enterprise Institute. And my relevant question is that, do Republicans tolerate this kind of behavior? Like, I was standing in food line at RNC headquarters and there was a white kid wearing shirt, deport Pedro. I'm sure that he will never do that at DNC, but at RNC it's all right. So my question is that a fear created by Democrat? It's the Republican tolerance for this kind of nonsense, I guess. Thanks.
I just want to throw out a piece of obscure historical political quasi-trivia.
Excellent.
There have been 4 times in American history where we have had 3 things coincide. One is a rapid wave of immigration in the previous decade and a half. The second is a dramatic economic collapse. And the third is the timing of the 36-year presidential cycle. Those were the 1860s, when Germans and Irish came to the country, and the Panic of 1857 depressed the American economy. 1896, when we went through about 8 years of economic calamity and massive immigration leading to the election of President McKinley. And the other, prior to this time, which is the 4th time, was the Great Depression. Prior to the immigration was started to cut off in 1925. We still had the massive immigration in the teens and the 20s. In each case, the political coalition that formed to dominate the succeeding era was the one that the immigrants backed. The Lincoln Coalition was dependent upon the German vote in the Midwest. The McKinley Coalition was dependent upon the immigrants in the North and the Midwest who worked in extractive industries and productive industries, and we all know about the role of the immigrants in Roosevelt's coalition, or the sons of immigrants there. So that's my piece of political trivia to obliquely answer your question.
Jim, do you have any thoughts on the immigration in the election?
Well, it's a difficult thing. I mean, about 20 years ago, the Republicans, I remember in California, said open-door immigration could be the death of the party, and they're right. But now we live in this situation we are now. I agree with Henry. We can't turn the clock back. We've reached a tipping point, so we have to be much more careful and hope for the best on this and try and cut into the immigrant. Obviously, Romney, in order to secure the nomination from Perry, who was his most important rival, went further than he wanted to and probably gave up some percentage of the Hispanic vote. But make no mistake about it, it's going to be a long time before the Republicans have a majority, if they ever do, of the Hispanic vote. And the minute this next immigration bill goes through, as it probably will, that's not going to be the end of it. The Democrats, the day after, will start saying, well, let's have citizenship in 5 years. And let's bring in the family of the immigrants immediately to increase the vote. That's just the way it is. The Republicans face real headwinds there. They might as well admit it and look for ways. But the reality would say that this is going to be a tough hoe. Look, on the whole thing of elections, you could do a stable analysis of what things would be, all things being equal, and probably the Democrats have an advantage, and their advantage is growing on that. But that's not how elections are won. Elections are won and lost according to circumstances. They're lost and won when one party screws up, and the other party comes in, and whatever it says, it shows that it can govern well. That would be the only thing that would be an important element that would make an important, not maybe victory, but large victory for the Republicans, is if the Democrats screwed up. After all, why did the Republicans win? Why did Reagan win in 1980? It wasn't because he spoke so nicely about the average person. It was because Jimmy Carter was president, and you look at that record, and a lot of people would say, okay, I'll take the risk. So don't divorce American elections from the situations in which people run. They're much more powerful, these situations, than the steady state analysis, which is obviously the only thing you can talk about when you can't talk about the conditions. And we don't know the conditions in 2016. We don't know whether there'll be a foreign policy crisis, which will utterly discredit the president's leading from behind strategy. We don't know whether the economy will have petered out in such a way that people would say, enough, I'm willing to take the risk.
So there's always hope.
There's always hope for change.
There's always hope that the other side is going to screw up.
That's what determines
That's-
elections. I mean, it determines major changes. The example would be 64. Why did the Republicans, who were, decimated in 64, why were they able to win 68? And you can go through and see the great moments. Why did FDR win in 1932? There's a reason. It was the Depression. I'm not saying this is the only thing, but when you look at elections, you'll see that the minority party, if you want to call the Republicans a slightly minority party at the national level, I would say it slightly is, and some things are running against it, always has a chance because the party that's running the government can mess up. I believe that the 2012 election would surely have gone to the Republicans if unemployment would have been 9%, as I said, rather than below 8%. Republican Party might have won the election in 2012 if it hadn't been for a hurricane. So it was that close, and it certainly would be close under different circumstances. So as much as you focus on coalitions and steady state analysis, don't forget that politics is event-driven in many ways.
Good. So hope and chance.
That's right.
Running is the contingency of politics. So I think on that we'll conclude. That was a good ending. There is hope. It's still America. So thank you very much. The book is on sale outside. Join us in buying it.
And I agree.